Saint Teresa of Avila explained why God allows terrifying spiritual attacks. Why does the soul tremble in the night? Why does the heart, even the devout heart, feel the icy breath of something unseen pressing against its peace? And why, above all, would a loving God permit a soul to endure the terror of spiritual attack? These questions rise like smoke from the deepest chambers of human experience, where fear and faith collide. They have troubled saints and sinners alike, and they whisper into the silence where the eternal wrestles with the fragile. It is here, in this mysterious and trembling place, that Saint Teresa of Avila speaks, her voice calm, contemplative, and forged in the fire of her own encounters. For Teresa was no stranger to darkness. She lived in a century of upheaval, of reform and suspicion, of hidden conflicts and unspoken dangers. But the most fearful battles she endured were not of flesh or of earth. They were the invisible invasions, those sudden waves of dread, those oppressive nights when her soul felt hunted. She would later write that at times the darkness was so thick it felt as though a great weight pressed upon the spirit, and yet these moments, terrifying as they were, became the door through which God revealed his unexpected mercy. She understood something many forget. Spiritual attack is not proof of God's absence. It is often the mysterious sign of his nearness. For in Teresa's theology, rooted in Scripture and anchored in the Catechism, every assault of the enemy is permitted only within the boundaries God draws. The creature may rage, but it cannot roam freely. The shadows may press in, but they cannot devour the soul that clings to Christ. When God allows terror to approach, it is never to destroy the one who suffers. It is to strengthen, purify, awaken, or protect them from a greater ruin. Teresa often compared these moments to the shaking of a building before a great cleansing. The soul, proud of its stability, suddenly learns that it has built on sand. When the darkness comes, pretenses collapse. False devotions fall away. The heart discovers its own poverty, and in that discovery finds the God who dwells with the poor of spirit. She would say that God allows spiritual attack so that the soul may finally choose him with clarity, not comfort. In the light, we love out of gratitude. In the terror, we love out of truth. And yet, Teresa never spoke of these trials with despair. She framed them as the painful tenderness of a God who refuses to let his children settle for mediocrity. A surgeon cuts so the wound may heal. A fire burns so the gold may shine. A storm rises so the roots grow deeper. Thus, the terrifying night becomes a hidden classroom, and the trembling soul becomes the soul that learns to kneel. Before we step further into this mystery, into the visions, the testimonies, and the profound theology that Teresa unfolds, I ask gently, there are nights when the soul feels utterly alone, so alone that even prayer seems to fall into a vast and hollow silence. These are the moments when the enemy approaches with subtlety or violence, seeking to unsettle the heart. But Saint Teresa of Avila insists that such nights are never wasted, nor are they signs of abandonment. Rather, they are the dimly lit corridors through which God leads the soul toward a clarity that daylight cannot give. She recounts that, in her early years of conversion, she was terrified by certain supernatural disturbances, shadows that seemed to move without shape, sudden chills that pierced her bones, an oppressive sense of being watched. Yet it was not the darkness itself that frightened her most. It was the uncertainty. Was this God? Was this the enemy? Or was this the fragile whisper of her own soul, awakening to realities she had avoided for years? In her fear, Teresa did what every trembling heart has done. She reached for God with a desperate cry, and it was in that cry, not in calm hours of reflection, that she discovered something extraordinary. She discovered that fear reveals what comfort hides, for comfort often makes the soul drowsy, confident in its own illusions. But fear, holy, purifying fear, strips everything away. It forces the soul to confront its foundations. Is my trust in feelings or in God? Is my faith rooted in peace or in truth? Am I praying because the path is serene, or because He alone is my refuge? Teresa writes that God allows terrifying spiritual attacks because He desires souls who know Him, not superficially, not sentimentally but intimately, through experience and battle. A soldier trained only in peaceful fields never learns to wield his armor. A lamp that never faces wind never learns the strength of its flame. Thus, when the enemy attacks, God permits the assault only so far as it will reveal the soul's dependence on him. If the soul clings, the darkness becomes a teacher. If the soul perseveres, fear becomes the threshold of deeper faith. Teresa describes one night when she felt a presence so hostile that her heart nearly stopped. She tried to pray but could not utter a word. Terror smothered every prayer. In that paralysis, she understood something she would never forget. Prayer is not a feeling, it is an act of the will. She forced her mind to say silently, "Jesus." And in that one word, spoken not with sweetness but with trembling, light pierced the room. She later reflected that God allowed that moment so she would never again confuse emotional ease with spiritual strength. Fear had shattered her illusions. What remained was real faith. In this way, the terrifying night becomes a furnace in which God burns away the fragile scaffolding of self-reliance. And when dawn finally comes, the soul is not the same. It sees more clearly. It trusts more deeply. It knows God not as an idea, but as a shelter. Now the path grows darker and holier. There comes a point in every spiritual life, whether early, late, or unexpectedly, when the soul realizes that it stands in the middle of a war it cannot see. The scriptures speak of this battle with sober clarity. Our struggle is not against flesh and blood. Saint Teresa of Avila knew this with an intimacy forged not in theory, but in experience. She understood that the enemy attacks not merely to frighten, but to divide, distort, and weaken the inner sanctuary where the soul communes with God. Yet she also learned something far more profound. The enemy can only enter the soul's story when God allows it, and never beyond the limits he sets. Teresa recounts moments when the assault felt physical, though it remained unseen. Doors seemed to close without cause. A suffocating presence pressed against her as though trying to crush her prayer. There were times when she felt a whisper, not audible, but chilling, seeking to twist her thoughts into despair. In these hours, she felt the boundary between the natural and supernatural thin to a terrifying fragility. But here lies the paradox that Teresa insists we contemplate. If God is sovereign, why would he allow the enemy to draw so near? Her answer is startling, humbling, and deeply consoling. God permits the assault not to doom the soul, but to unveil the truth about its spiritual state. When darkness approaches, the soul discovers its vulnerabilities, its pride, its hidden attachments, its unconfessed fears. The attack exposes the cracks in the interior walls, revealing where repentance, surrender, or purification is still needed. God allows this unveiling so that the soul may grow into its true identity, one who stands firm in him, not in itself. Teresa goes further. She explains that the enemy's rage is often a sign of imminent grace. When a soul is approaching deeper union with God, the enemy strikes harder, not because he is stronger, but because he senses the nearness of a divine work he cannot prevent. His fury becomes the unintentional herald of God's blessing. Thus, what seems like punishment may actually be preparation. What appears as terror may be the threshold of transformation. Teresa describes one such moment of profound turmoil. She felt an overwhelming spiritual pressure that sought to crush her resolve and suffocate her prayer. Yet in the very center of that storm, a quiet realization dawned. The enemy was only permitted to touch the periphery of her being, never the sanctuary where God dwelled. That sanctuary she knew belonged to God alone. No darkness could enter unless the soul itself surrendered the door. This insight became her shield. No matter how violent the spiritual disturbance, she clung to the truth that her soul was held in the hand of the One who commands every power. And in this clinging, in this fierce, trembling trust, the attack became a moment of profound growth. Teresa insists that terrifying spiritual attacks, though painful, become holy turning points. They purify, they awaken, they forge courage where fear once reigned. And so, the night deepens. The mystery unfolds. There is a sacred moment in every spiritual journey when the soul begins to understand that the trials it faces are not punishments, but invitations. Saint Teresa of Avila, with her penetrating mystical vision, perceived that terrifying spiritual attacks often come at the very threshold of transformation. They are not random cruelties, they are the rumblings of a deeper grace preparing to enter the interior castle of the soul. Teresa describes the soul as a luminous palace with many dwelling places, some bright, some dim, some still shrouded in shadow. As the soul advances inward toward the central chamber where God abides in radiant silence, the enemy becomes increasingly desperate, for the closer the soul draws to God, the more its light threatens the dominion of darkness. Thus, the attacks intensify, not because the soul is failing, but because it is nearing the heart of divine intimacy. Why would God allow such terror near this holy ascent? Teresa explains, purification requires exposure. The deeper chambers of the soul cannot be opened unless the false securities we cling to are shaken loose. When the enemy attacks, he unintentionally reveals the very attachments that impede our union with God. Fear exposes where trust is weak. Temptation unveils where desire needs cleansing. Interior disturbance reveals the walls we have not yet surrendered. In this way, the attack becomes a mirror, and the mirror becomes mercy. Teresa recounts a time when, during deep prayer, she felt an invisible pressure pushing against her chest, choking her breath, filling her mind with sudden confusion. She knew this was not from God, yet she did not flee. Instead, she remained still in the presence of the one she adored. In that stillness, she realized the attack was not a sign of her spiritual weakness. It was a sign that she was entering a purer chamber of the soul. The enemy pressed from the outside, but something greater stirred within. A gentle, expanding brightness that no darkness could touch. This, she says, is why God allows terrifying spiritual attacks, not to torment the soul, but to strengthen it, to deepen its roots, to teach it the fierce tenderness of divine protection. A flame grows brighter when tested by wind. Gold becomes pure only in fire, and the soul becomes truly free only when it confronts the fear it once avoided. Teresa insists that the enemy's chaos is temporary, but the virtue gained from enduring it is eternal. With every assault permitted by God, the soul learns to distinguish his voice from all others. It learns to trust not in consolation, but in him. And this trust, born in trembling and sealed in perseverance, becomes the key that unlocks the next chamber of the interior castle. Thus, what begins in terror ends in transformation. The night becomes the doorway. The fear becomes the purification. And the purified soul becomes capable of deeper love. The path now leads into even more profound mysteries. There are seasons in the spiritual life when God withdraws sensible comforts not out of coldness, but out of a love so deep it refuses to leave the soul dependent on anything less than himself. Saint Teresa of Avila knew this intimately. She understood that sometimes God allows the enemy to press close not merely to test the soul, but to illuminate the profound difference between divine presence and emotional consolation. For there are moments, mysterious, disorienting moments, when the soul feels abandoned even though God is closer than ever. Teresa calls this the painful mercy, the strange tenderness of a God who teaches the soul to walk by faith rather than by spiritual sweetness. He hides not to punish but to strengthen. He allows spiritual darkness so the soul may learn to cling to him in pure trust, without needing to feel his touch. It is precisely in this divine withdrawal that the enemy often attempts his fiercest assaults. Teresa recounts a time in her life when prayer felt barren, when even the name of Jesus seemed to echo without warmth in the chambers of her heart. She felt watched, surrounded, unsettled. It was as though the shadows waited for her to despair. And for a brief moment the temptation arose. Was she praying in vain? Had God turned his face from her? Yet in that dark hour, she discovered one of the most profound truths of the spiritual journey. The absence of feeling is not the absence of God. The enemy can disturb emotions, but he cannot touch the soul's deepest center where God dwells. And when God permits the enemy to shake the soul's surface, it is so the soul may descend into its interior refuge and discover that God is still there, silent perhaps, but sovereign. Teresa writes that this is how God teaches the soul to distinguish him from all counterfeits. Consolations can be imitated, sensations can be manipulated, even visions can deceive. But true divine presence, discovered in silent trust, cannot be faked, and the enemy cannot mimic it. Thus, the terrifying spiritual attack becomes the very instrument by which God reveals his incomparable light. Teresa describes a moment during one such trial when a sudden clarity pierced her mind. The darkness pressing upon her was not a sign of spiritual failure, but of spiritual elevation. She was being invited to love God not for what he gave, but for who he is. And in that realization, the fear loosened its grip. It did not disappear immediately, but it lost its authority. In this way, God uses darkness to teach the soul what daylight never could. He uses fear to uncover the deeper layers of faith. He allows the enemy to roar so the soul may learn the sound of the shepherd's whisper. For when everything else is stripped away, only truth remains. And the soul that learns to trust God in darkness will shine with a light that darkness cannot comprehend. The journey now turns toward even deeper mysteries, where spiritual attack reveals not only the soul's weakness, but God's hidden strength. There is a mysterious grace that blooms only in the soil of suffering, one that Saint Teresa of Avila came to recognize not merely as a consolation after trial, but as a hidden strength born within the trial itself. Terrifying spiritual attacks, she discovered, do not leave the faithful soul weaker. They leave it transformed, tempered, and strangely fortified by a power that is not its own. For Teresa realized that God often plants his greatest strength in the very places where the soul feels most wounded. She would later write that some of her deepest moments of spiritual fortitude came not when she felt the warmth of divine presence, but when she endured the cold shadow of spiritual assault. The enemy's pressure, heavy, suffocating, and disorienting, became a peculiar anvil upon which God forged virtues she never knew she lacked: perseverance, humility, vigilance, and a courage that did not arise from her own heart. It was during these trials that she discovered a truth that echoes through the entire Christian tradition. When the soul reaches the end of its own strength, it begins to rely on God's strength alone. This shift is not merely psychological, it is spiritual. It is the movement from self-reliance to divine reliance. And such a movement often requires that the soul be brought to its knees, stripped of every illusion of control. God allows the enemy to press just enough that the soul's fragile supports collapse, yet never so much that the soul is destroyed. The hand of God rests firmly upon the limit. Teresa recounts a particularly violent night in her early years of contemplation. She felt an oppressive darkness that sought to suffocate her prayer, as though every breath of faith was being smothered. In her fear, she cried out silently to Christ, not with eloquence, but with raw desperation. And it was in that cry, trembling, honest, almost broken, that she felt a sudden, overwhelming clarity. She realized she had nothing left to fight with, except him. And that was enough. Teresa wrote that in that moment, a profound inner shift occurred. She felt no sudden warmth, no consoling vision. Instead, she felt a stillness, firm, immovable, like a rock rising beneath her feet. It was not her strength. It was his. God had revealed a foundation she did not know she possessed because she had mistaken his strength for her own. From that night on, she recognized that terrifying spiritual attacks are permitted not only to expose weakness, but to unveil hidden strength, the strength God places deep within the soul when it finally releases its own. This is why, she explains, some souls grow rapidly after enduring spiritual trials. They learn to pray with humility. They cling to God with sincerity. They understand the necessity of grace. They walk more carefully, more vigilantly, more lovingly. The trial becomes the womb of virtue. And perhaps most mysteriously of all, the soul that has endured darkness with faith becomes a light for others still walking through shadows. We now stand at the threshold of an even deeper revelation, where Teresa begins to unveil what happens when the soul finally surrenders fully to God's work in these attacks. There comes a moment, hidden and holy, when the soul realizes that resistance alone cannot win the invisible battle. St. Teresa of Avila teaches that spiritual attack is not conquered by force, nor by intellectual arguments, nor by the frantic effort to drive away fear. Instead, victory comes through something far more paradoxical, something the enemy cannot imitate nor understand: total surrender to God. Surrender for Teresa is not a passive collapse. It is an active, deliberate turning of the soul toward God in the very moment when darkness is pressing most fiercely. The enemy seeks to isolate, to terrify, to provoke frantic self-defense. But when the soul responds not by fighting alone, but by yielding itself entirely into God's hands, the enemy's strategy collapses. For he cannot battle a soul that has ceased to rely on itself. Teresa often described surrender as the deepest act of trust a soul can offer. It is the moment when the soul recognizes its true condition, that without God it has nothing, with God it lacks nothing. This posture disarms every spiritual assault because it removes the one thing the enemy tries to exploit: self-reliance. She recounts an experience in her later years during a period of intense interior trial. Thoughts, distractions, temptations, and a heavy, suffocating darkness clouded her prayer. She tried to resist, to push back, to regain clarity by her own strength. But the more she fought, the more the pressure grew. It was as if the enemy's shadow fed upon her resistance. Only when she grew too weary to continue did she fall into a wordless surrender, whispering in the silence of her heart, "Let everything be as you will, Lord. I am yours." At that instant, not hours later, not after long effort, the darkness receded. Not entirely, but enough for her to breathe, enough for her to see, enough for her to understand. She realized that fear thrives where control is clung to. The moment the soul releases the illusion of control, fear loses its authority. This, she insists, is one of the central reasons God allows terrifying spiritual attacks: to bring the soul to perfect surrender. Not surrender to darkness, but surrender to divine will, unconditional, trusting, free. In this surrender, several profound transformations occur. The soul stops negotiating with fear. It no longer tries to outthink the attack, but rests in God's sovereignty. The soul discovers its true freedom, for nothing is more liberating than letting God be God. The soul becomes inaccessible to the enemy. The enemy can influence the senses, but he cannot reach the heart that has yielded itself entirely to God. The soul finds peace in the very center of turmoil, a peace not of emotion, but of truth, quiet, unshakable, eternal. Teresa explains that surrender does not remove all trials, but it transforms them. The storm may continue, but it no longer owns the soul. The darkness may linger, but it cannot command fear. The enemy may roar, but the roar echoes outside the sanctuary, where the surrendered soul rests with God. This is the hidden power Teresa wishes every soul to discover. And now, with her guidance, we move toward the next revelation, the one in which God begins to reclaim the very battlefield of the attack. There is a moment in every deep spiritual trial when the soul senses a shift, not because the attack has ended, but because God has stepped onto the field in a way that transforms the very meaning of the battle. Saint Teresa of Avila teaches that this shift is subtle, quiet, almost imperceptible at first. Yet it is decisive. It is the moment when the soul realizes it is no longer merely enduring the assault, but participating in God's victory over it. Teresa understood that the battlefield of spiritual attack is not the realm of darkness, but the interior space where the soul encounters God. The enemy seeks to occupy that space through fear, confusion, and turbulence, but God allows the enemy to approach only so that he may ultimately reclaim, sanctify, and transform that very territory. For Teresa, this reclamation is not dramatic. It does not come with thunder, visions, or sudden deliverance. Instead, it begins in a whisper, a subtle strengthening that quietly rises in the soul like dawn breaking through the thinnest line of horizon. The darkness remains, but it is no longer the master. God is. She recounts a period in her middle years when she felt besieged by interior disturbances, shadows in prayer, oppressive silence, and temptations that seemed to leap from nowhere. She felt hunted, spiritually cornered. Yet in the midst of this turmoil, she noticed something unexpected. a strange, gentle courage slowly awakening within her. She could not explain it. It was not her own. In time, she recognized it for what it was. God reclaiming the interior battlefield. Instead of fleeing from prayer, she found herself drawn to it. Instead of shrinking from darkness, she felt a growing steadiness. Instead of collapsing under the weight of fear, she sensed a quiet defiance, holy, humble, rooted in him. It was as though God had stepped between her soul and the enemy, not removing the attack but transforming her relationship to it. Teresa teaches that this is how God reclaims the soul. He strengthens the will before he calms the emotions. The soul learns to choose him even while trembling. He illuminates the mind before he comforts the senses. Truth becomes a torch in the fog. He deepens humility before granting victory. The soul learns that God fights for it and within it. He turns the very place of fear into a place of encounter. What was once a battlefield becomes a sanctuary. This divine strategy confounds the enemy, for while he hopes to break the soul through terror, the soul becomes instead more anchored, more prayerful, more dependent on God. The very attacks meant to destroy it end by drawing it deeper into God's heart. This is the mystery Teresa unveils. The soul under attack becomes a consecrated place, a site of divine action. And so the battlefield becomes holy ground. The darkness becomes a threshold. The enemy's rage becomes the backdrop against which God writes his victory. The journey now moves toward the highest peaks of this mystery, when the soul, strengthened by God, begins to understand the purpose of every trial it has endured. There comes a point in the soul's long journey through fear, darkness, and spiritual assault when the scattered fragments of suffering begin, slowly, to align. Not all at once, not with full clarity, but with the quiet certainty that nothing, absolutely nothing, was wasted. Saint Teresa of Avila teaches that every moment of terror, every trembling prayer, every night of confusion carries within it a hidden purpose crafted by God's hand. For Teresa, this purpose does not emerge during the attack itself. In the midst of the storm, the soul sees only shadows and survival. But afterward, when surrender has been learned, when the spiritual muscles of faith have strengthened, when God has reclaimed the interior battlefield, the soul begins to understand. A holy light rises over the landscape of its suffering, illuminating what once seemed meaningless. Teresa writes that the purpose of terrifying spiritual attacks becomes visible in three distinct revelations. First, the soul discovers who it truly is before God. Trials strip away illusions of strength, of self-sufficiency, of spiritual progress based on emotional comfort. What remains is truth, a soul wholly dependent on grace. Teresa insists that this humility is not humiliation, it is liberation. It frees the soul from the tyranny of its own expectations and places it firmly into God's loving sovereignty. Second, the soul learns how deeply God desires its love. Teresa maintains that God allows these trials, not because he is distant, but because he seeks a love purified from all conditions. When the soul continues to pray, continues to trust, continues to cling to him in darkness, it offers God the most precious love it can give, a love unfiltered by emotion, unadorned by consolation, born purely from faith. Third, the soul becomes spiritually fruitful for others. This, Teresa says, is the most hidden purpose of suffering. A soul that has walked through darkness with God becomes a beacon for those still wandering in night. It prays with greater depth. It intercedes with greater compassion. It speaks with an authority forged not in books, but in the furnace of experience. The wounds it endured become windows through which God's mercy shines. Teresa recounts how, after enduring years of interior battles, she found herself uniquely able to guide others through their own struggles. She could recognize the signs of attack, the patterns of fear, the subtle lies of the enemy. But more importantly, she could speak of God's faithfulness with a conviction that pierced hearts. Her suffering had become her mission. This is why, she insists, God allows terrifying spiritual attacks, not to break the soul, but to shape it, not to darken it, but to cleanse it, not to silence it, but to give it a voice capable of leading others toward Him. The purpose of suffering is not seen at the beginning. It is revealed as a dawn that rises slowly over the mountains of trial, unveiling a landscape transformed by God's hidden work. And now, in the final ascent, Teresa leads us to the last mystery, where suffering becomes glory and the soul emerges with a peace no darkness can threaten. At the summit of every spiritual trial, after the fear, after the surrender, after the long nights in which God seemed silent, there comes a moment so gentle, so quiet, so unlike what the soul expected, that it almost goes unnoticed. Saint Teresa of Avila calls this moment la paz que no se puede explicar, the peace that cannot be explained. It is the peace born not from the absence of battle, but from God's victory within the soul. In the final unfolding of her teaching, Teresa reveals that terrifying spiritual attacks are not the last word in the journey of the faithful. They are thresholds, they are purifications, they are the dark tunnels through which the soul passes into a chamber of profound intimacy with God, a chamber that could not have been reached any other way. For Teresa explains that once the soul has endured darkness with faith, surrendered control, clung to God in silence, and allowed him to reclaim the interior battlefield, something wondrous begins to blossom within, a peace that the enemy cannot counterfeit, a joy that suffering cannot extinguish, a strength that does not arise from the soul but from God himself. This peace does not always come with emotion. It is not a sweetness or a feeling. It is a certainty, quiet, deep, and immovable, that God is God, that he has been faithful, and that nothing the enemy does can undo what God has done in the soul. Teresa writes that this peace is the crown placed upon the soul that has persevered. It is the fruit of suffering transformed by grace. It is the light found only by those who dared to walk through the valley of shadows with their eyes fixed on him. She describes this transformation with an image both tender and powerful. The soul becomes like iron plunged into fire. At first the fire burns, shapes, purifies, but then, only then, does the iron begin to shine with the very glow of the flame. It carries the fire within it. It becomes radiant, strengthened, and unbreakable. In this way, the soul that has endured spiritual attack becomes outwardly gentle but inwardly invincible. It fears nothing, not because it is strong but because it knows the one who is. Temptations may still whisper, shadows may still pass by, but they no longer strike the heart with the same force. The soul has discovered its refuge, and that refuge is unshakable. Teresa teaches that the final purpose of terrifying spiritual attacks is not merely purification or humility or spiritual fruitfulness, though these are great gifts. The ultimate purpose is union with God in a deeper, truer, more stable way than the soul could ever have imagined. It is a union forged not in sweetness, but in fidelity, not in visions, but in trust, not in ease, but in the long, trembling yes spoken in the darkness. And when that union is reached, even imperfectly on earth, the soul becomes a vessel of peace for others. It carries God's steadiness into a world trembling in fear. Its wounds become its witness. Its silence becomes its testimony. Its history of suffering becomes its mission. Thus ends the mystery Teresa unveils. God allows terrifying spiritual attacks only so that, through them, the soul may become entirely his. And the soul that belongs to him is a soul that cannot be moved. Here then the journey finds its rest, not in ease, but in God, not in silence, but in his voice, not in darkness, but in the light that darkness can never overcome.